Okay, well, we're going to be beginning chapter 5 of Hebrews today. And we're really getting now into the crux of what the book of Hebrews is about. And that is Christ as the great high priest. We've been building up to this really since the beginning. He's the author of Hebrews has been laying the foundation for developing this truth. You remember in chapter 1, he established the significance of the divine nature of Christ. And then in chapter 2, establishing his human nature. And then with those two building blocks established, we get our first mention of Christ as our high priest. And the significance of those two first realities of his divine nature and his human nature was significant in the fact that he was our priest, that he had to be one of us. He had to be a man to represent us as our high priest. But his divine nature, meaning that he did not have to do the priestly work on his own behalf. And then we went into a different topic about hearing from the voice of God and not hardening our hearts to the voice of God. But then he brought that back to the idea of the great high priest. And we talked about that last week at the end of chapter 4 as he begins to go back into this topic. And chapter 5 really through chapter 7 really goes into a lot of detail about the significance of Christ as our great high priest. So in chapter 5 and verse 1, he begins the next sequence of the case that he's building, of the truth that he's building. And what he does, interestingly, is he starts off in verse 1 by talking about a human high priest. And we're going to see is how he compares and contrasts certain aspects of the nature of an earthly high priest versus Christ as our great high priest. So in verse 1 he says, "Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins." And so the first thing that he mentions that's significant is that the high priest was selected from among men. And the idea that a man does not decide for himself to become a priest. The priesthood is something that is chosen for him. Yeah, he is taken, as the word literally means in the Greek. He's taken by God to be separated out from others, I should say, to do this work. And they're selected from among men and appointed to represent them. And that word appointed, it means literally to place or to stand down, to designate or ordain somebody. And the idea is an official appointment with authority and by authority, much like a judge might be appointed, for example, by a chief executive. And so the idea here, once again, is that a man doesn't choose to become a priest. God ordains him to be a priest. God selects him, takes him out from amongst the crowd, you might say, and chooses him to be a priest, ordains him or appoints him. And while he is chosen by God from among men, his purpose is for them. It says he's appointed to represent them. So even though God is pulling them out, so to speak, taking them from amongst the population to be his high priest, they're doing so for our benefit, to represent us. And so, what are they representing us in? And that is in matters related to God. And this is kind of the crux, you might say, of the purpose of this office. And that is, he represents the people of God before God, and you might say about the things of God. That is not mere human concerns, but spiritual concerns. And he does two things, or offers two things. It says he offers gifts and sacrifices for sin. And what's the distinction between those two when he says he offers gifts and sacrifices? There really is a distinction between those two, although they are both offices and work of the priesthood. You remember from from studying the tabernacle and the things that go on there. Do you remember the distinction between those two? Can you think of things that might be an example of gifts versus sacrifices for sin?
Well, sacrifice for sin, wouldn't that have been to slaughter an animal?
Yes, it was a blood. Yes, exactly. It was a blood sacrifice. It was the sacrifice of a life, of an innocent life, for to expiate the sins of the people. And that was something that he did once a year on the Day of Atonement, where that bull or whatever would be slaughtered. The blood would be applied to. He would go into the Holy of Holies, and the blood would be applied to the mercy seat, which was the lid on the Ark of the Covenant. And that would be the sacrifice for the sins of the people. But the gifts that he mentions were other kinds of offerings that the high priest would offer periodically. And these refer to, we might call them kind of the love offerings or thank offerings that the people would give to God. They were often called meal or grain offerings. They're mentioned in Leviticus chapter 6 and verse 14, where it talks about bringing meal offerings to God. And then the sacrifices for sin were mentioned in Leviticus 6, verses 24 through 30, and that was what you were talking about. So there are two different things. One is the sacrifice that represented the atonement for the sins of the people. The other being more like the thankfulness gifts that they would give to God. Both of those were part of the priestly work. And you see, both of them, the point he's making here was that this was an office that God would choose men to do, appoint men to do, but even though they were doing this work for God, they were also doing it for our benefit. It was the people's, to the people's relationship with God and their responses to God and their spiritual lives to God. These were all matters related to God and their spiritual life individually and corporately as a people. So that was his job. That was his job. That was his office. Well, there were limitations, though, with what he could do, with the effectiveness of a human or earthly high priest. And we see that in verses 2 and 3. It says, he, speaking of the human high priest, he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. So he's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray. So what this is a picture of, in an ideal sense, I think it's questionable whether they really had this attitude in some cases, but this is the ideal. The picture is of a compassionate priest who understands the problems and challenges of those who wander from the truth through ignorance, not necessarily evil intent. When he used that phrase, those who are ignorant, the Greek word there is agnoio, where we get the word agnostic from. And basically the structure of that word, it's a compound word. The root word gnosis, which means knowledge, with that A in front of it, is like putting a not in front of it. So the idea is it's not to know. And not to know through having a lack of information, you might say. And so why am I pointing that out? Because what the author is talking about here is not a priest who is compassionate and understanding about outright deliberate evil. We're talking about people who have just simply gone astray because they don't understand, because they haven't heard the truth, because they have not heard what God asks of them. Those who are ignorant, they have a lack of information, so he has compassion. And it's interesting that that phrase, going astray, it's sometimes translated wanderer. The word there is planeo. It's related to the Greek word planetes, which is translated as wanderer in Jude 13, but it's where we get our English word planet from. Now, if you know anything about the origin of planet and why planets are called planets, do you remember, teachers? Because this is something y'all probably have taught, right?
Not to fifth graders.
It means wandering star. The ancient Greeks called them planets or wanderers because in astronomy they would, as they would observe the heavens, the stars, the actual stars, stay in the same place related to each other, but planets wander through them. They're not in the same place all the time because they're not out in space. They're orbiting around the sun just like we are. So as you watch them, Mars or Jupiter, from day to day, it will be in a different place every time you look at it. It's wandering through the heavens. So they call them wandering stars, and that's what the word planet means. Okay? Well, that root word is the same word that is used here for that phrase, going astray. So the idea is they're wandering away, although in this case, instead of a physical wandering, it's a wandering from the truth. Wandering from understanding. So the high priest is able, it says, to be compassionate, to deal gently with those. Why? And this gets to his point about his limitations. He himself is subject to weakness. So because the high priest, even though they've been called by God for this great office, they themselves are just fallible, frail men themselves. It says they're subject to weakness. That word there means encircled by it. So it's just have in your mind a picture of someone with encircled or by something that completely surrounds them. And so what's surrounding them is this weakness, which means frailty or feebleness of either mind or body. The idea here is that they're powerless to break out of this bond of weakness. And in this case, in this context, it's not a physical weakness, it's a moral or a spiritual weakness. And so the idea is, because the priest himself struggles with these same frailties, he can be compassionate to those who are struggling with those weaknesses. And so, because of having that same frailty, this leads to the ultimate limitation, which he will mention several times, even going into chapter 7. He'll come back to this because it's so important. Is that even though in his office he is to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people, he also has to offer those same sacrifices for his own sins because he himself is a sinner. He says this is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. Going back to Leviticus, in Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 6, the Bible says the first high priest, you remember who the first high priest was? Aaron. Aaron, it says in Leviticus 16, offered a bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself. So before he could be considered ritualistically pure, before he could himself enter the Holy of Holies to offer the sacrifices for the sins of the people, he had to offer a sacrifice for his own sin. It says he had to offer the sacrifice for his own sin. That phrase, he has to, I want to point that out. Hello, girl. Can I pet you or are you going to growl at me? Can I pet? Oh, You gonna grab at me?
You're so
It's
bad.
all what. It's like, yeah, you trust him, but you gotta watch it.
Can you come over here and lay down, please?
That phrase, he has to, that is, he has to offer sacrifices, that phrase is a Greek word that means to accrue or to owe something or to be under obligation. And I think it's important to point that out because that word is implying that even the high priest has a debt that is accruing. It's something that he owes that he cannot pay. And of course we know what that debt is. It's the debt of the penalty of his own sin. And he has to bear that along. He has to to bring that burden for his own sin. Now, in the NIV, the way that it structures this phrase, he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And that's accurate, but I want to just kind of transliterate the way it's structured in the actual Greek text because I think it emphasizes well the equality in terms of their sinful nature before God, of the priest and the people. It says, even as for the people, so also for himself. If you transliterate the Greek, that's the structure. Even as for the people, so also for himself. So the structure, I think, makes that relationship clear, is that in terms of their nature, their spiritual nature before God, the high priest and the rest of the people are the same. They've got the same problem, they've got the same weakness, they've got the same debt accruing before God. So even though the high priest has this office of sacrificing the people, he first has to sacrifice for himself. So despite his great purpose and his great office and his great job, the high priest really has little power in himself to expiate the penalty of the sins of the people, because he also owes this debt, and it continues to accrue. And this is jumping ahead to chapter 7, but that's why it's one of the great contrasts between him and Christ, our great high priest, because the reason, and again I'm jumping ahead, but it's important here, they call that day that the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies the Day of Atonement. In the Hebrew, it's Yom Kippur. That's where they get that name of the Jewish holiday, the Day of Atonement. It happens every year. The idea is that what they do isn't permanent. That offer, that sacrifice has to be done again and again and again, year after year. That it's not a once for all, and that's the great distinction between the earthly high priest work and our great high priest work, which was only once for all time. They have to keep going back, because what they're doing isn't really permanently taking care of the penalty for the sins of the people. It is only representative. It's a picture. What he's doing doesn't really have in itself power to atone for the sins of the people. It is only a picture or a representation of what Christ will be doing. So, in verse 4, he mentions about how he becomes a priest. Verse 4 says, "No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God just as Aaron was." It's not, as we mentioned before, this is not a work that a man can decide for himself that he's going to do. He's not going to wake up one morning and say, "I want to be a priest." It does not work that way. It's an honor he does not take upon himself. He has to be called by God. God decides and chooses who he's going to call and take up the priesthood. Just as Aaron was, he says. Exodus 28 tells us about how the first high priest, Aaron, became high priest. He did not volunteer. God chose him and said, take Aaron and sacrifice sacrifice it. Not sacrifice it. I got my story mixed up with Abraham and Isaac. No. Take Aaron and separate, not sacrifice, separate him out. You
What are
know,
those S words? Separate, sacrifice, same thing.
I guess both, but no, he didn't sacrifice Aaron. No. Separate him
Moses
out.
would have been in trouble.
Right, really. And that whole chapter talks about how, you know, he told him how to make the robe and all the things that were on the robe and all the things that Aaron was supposed to do. But it was all what God told Moses to tell Aaron to do. Okay? The priesthood is a very specific office that is not necessarily directly related to the way we think about our service to God, because none of us are priests, okay? And so the priesthood isn't really necessarily relevant to the way we think about what we do. However, there is a very important corollary here that I think does relate, and that is the idea that whatever our purpose is in life is something God calls us to. God calls us to our purpose. And when He does so, He enables and empowers us to accomplish that. Now, what we're called to is not being a priest, but God, surely, if we are a believer, if we are His child, He calls us to something. He calls us to a mission. He calls us to a work. And rarely does that have anything to do with what we might imagine is what we think we ought to do. I would never have picked this for what I would do. This is probably, if you knew me back in the 80s, this is the last thing I would have ever said, this is what I want to do. You know, it's not, He picks us not because of even our abilities or our desires or our plans necessarily, but He makes those decisions based on what He is going to make of us. And He empowers and enables us to accomplish what He calls us to do. You can make the case that Aaron was not spiritually qualified to be the high priest of the people. When you look at what happened to Aaron the first time he was left in charge,
Yeah.
do you remember what happened the first time Moses left him in charge?
They built idols and
Yeah.
golden calves. And
I threw the gold in and it just came
just
out a
came out.
calf.
There was a calf, yeah.
And, you know, Moses, oh gosh. Clearly Aaron was not spiritually qualified to be the great high priest of the people. But that's not why God called him and chose him to be a high priest. Clearly I'm not qualified to teach the Bible, but God called me to do that. And so He promises that He'll enable me to be able to do it, subject to my human weaknesses, which are many. So, with all of that as the background, thinking about an earthly or human high priest, Aaron and his descendants, verse 5 now begins to present a comparison and a contrast, thinking about Christ as our high priest. Verse 5 and 6 says, "So Christ also did not take upon Himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to Him, 'You are my Son, today I have become your Father.' And He says in another place, 'You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek.'" So Christ, He says, did not take this upon Himself. In this sense, Christ as our great high priest is like the human high priest in that He was called to this office by God. He did not take upon Himself this glory of becoming a high priest. That is to say, He did not glorify Himself. And when you look at through his earthly ministry, and you recall the many times that he deflected all glory and praise to him. And he always said, these aren't my words, these are my Father's. This is not my work, this is my Father's. You know, he would say this over and over again. He always made it clear that what he was doing was not his will, but the Father's will. And so that's what he's getting at here, is that even though that Christ was called by God to be our great high priest and did not glorify himself, he always glorified the Father. The glory of him being the great high priest was bestowed upon him by God glorifying him. And so it was God who called him and summoned him. Now, here in verses 5 and 6, he makes two important quotations. The first one he's mentioned before. We saw this one back in chapter 1. It's a repeat of that same quote, "You're my son, today I become your father." It's from Psalm 2:7. Now, if you recall, in chapter 1, the author used this quote to demonstrate this unique relationship between God the Father and God the Son. And it was him developing the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus. Here he is using that same quotation to tie this relationship to his priestly work. Because it's coming right on in the context of him saying that God called him to this priestly work. So he uses that same phrase, that quotation, "You're my son, today I become your father," in the sense of he is calling, God is calling his son, appointing him to this office of the priesthood. But in this case, he is calling a divine person, Christ, not a man, but divine, to be our great high priest. Then he makes this other quote, that you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Two things to point out here. First of all, I won't go into too much detail about Melchizedek, because in chapter 7, the author of Hebrews is going to take more of a deep dive. This is more of just introducing the idea to keep in the back of our mind. When we get to chapter 7, we'll talk more about the significance of who this Melchizedek is. But for now, we're just going to kind of look at it at the surface level of why he mentions him here, why he makes this quotation. First of all, he says, "You're a priest forever." The word there is where we get our English word eon from, and it means ageless. And what he's speaking of here is this unique, eternal nature. And why is that important? Well, when you think about the earthly priesthood, Aaron, okay, how many high priests were there from Aaron through the New Testament days? Well, I don't know. I'm not asking because I expect you to know. I'm just saying the point is there were many. Because, you know, the high priest would die, another would take his place, and would die. It would, you know, a whole string of high priests throughout history because they were men. They only lived a certain amount of time and they would die. Well, this priest, this great high priest, was a priest forever. Because of his divine nature, he would be the first and only great high priest because he is of his eternal nature, as opposed or distinguished from that temporary nature of mortal man. And then he says, after the order of Melchizedek. And like I said, we're going to talk more about him in chapter 7. But suffice this now, this is another example of this interpretive principle we've been talking about since chapter 1 called Midrash. And just for your benefit, since this is your first time here since we've been in Hebrews, this was, Midrash was an interpretive principle that you saw from the Jewish scholars, that where they would take an Old Testament passage and they would add a new level of interpretation of terms of what it signified in light of new information, in such a way that it doesn't erase the old meaning, but it adds a new meaning on top of it. And the author of Hebrews makes use of it throughout his letter in taking the new information that we know based on Jesus Christ and adding this new layer of interpretation on Old Testament scriptures that, again, don't erase what was there before, but just adds a new level of our understanding as we understand what it was pointing to.
You now have an eye opener, you have an example.
Right. Prophecy is an example of that. It's not the only form of midrash, but prophecy is an example of it, where something is said, in an Old Testament scripture that has a historical contextual meaning, but then later on we realize that it was also a prophecy of some future event. That's an example of it, but it's not limited to just prophecy. Okay, so this is another example of that when he mentions Melchizedek here. His quotation is actually from Psalm 110, because Psalm 110 mentions it. It's a reference to this mysterious man who is originally mentioned in Genesis 14:18. So again, I won't go into the details about that. We'll mention that in chapter 7. But the two things are, first of all, Psalm 110 itself is a psalm that was written to celebrate the coronation of a king. Okay? And so his quotation a minute ago from Psalm 2 was talking about, in this context, Christ being appointed to be a priest. This quotation from Psalm 110 is a coronation of a king. So we have the idea of Christ being a priest and a king. And in fact, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Now, why he mentions him is significant, because when we look historically at who this Melchizedek was, he is mentioned in Genesis 14 as both a priest and a king. So, what the author of Hebrews is saying in this quotation is that Jesus is our great high priest. He's not a priest after the order of Aaron, who was just a man, who was a fallible man, who made mistakes, and who eventually died. He is a priest of a different order, after Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a priest and a king. And again, I don't want to jump too far ahead because it's a very interesting study, and we'll talk about it in chapter 7, but apparently the belief was that Melchizedek was actually a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, of the Son of God, because it mentions that he did not die. And so this great high priest is of a different order, not Aaron, but of Melchizedek. Now, I'm going to leave off there. Verse 7 will now that we've transitioned from talking about an earthly priest, we're now going to talk about the work of Christ as the priest. So that will take us basically to through verse 10. Then we're going to have a little parentheses about something else, and then come back in chapter 7 to talk about the great high priest again.